They don't pay very much for military, and the reason they don't pay much is they assume that we're going to protect them. They have a very small military. They rely on our military. We basically protect Canada.
We've made major investments in defense in recent months. We're committed to accelerating that.
He looks to build new security, relationships that are outside of our relationship with the U.S. Some other countries are also reviewing their contracts to buy these very expensive fighter jets from the U.S. over trade concerns. Mark Carney is committed to hitting the NATO 2% of GDP on defense spending target. They've committed to make more in Canada. Breaking news: Donald Trump is in a rage. As America's skies are thrown into turmoil, Canada has just seized a massive fighter jet contract once bound for U.S. manufacturers, leaving the Pentagon blindsided and scrambling. From Washington to Detroit, shockwaves are tearing through America's defense industry tonight. Just weeks ago, President Donald Trump stood at the podium in Washington, vowing to defend American workers and shield the nation's defense industry from foreign competition. He promised tariffs, contracts, and policies designed to keep U.S. jobs in American hands. From the steel mills of Pennsylvania to the aerospace hubs of Seattle and Fort Worth, the message was clear: America first. But trade wars have consequences. After months of escalating tariffs stalled negotiations and repeated threats, Canada has struck back with a stunning maneuver, claiming the very fighter jet contracts once seen as untouchable, symbols of U.S. military supremacy. Before we go on, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the simplest way to support the channel, and you won't want to miss what's coming up next. Let's dive in. In Ottawa, the announcement landed like a thunderclap. Canada has formally awarded billions of dollars in next-generation fighter jet contracts to a coalition of European manufacturers, effectively freezing out the United States for the first time in decades. These contracts, long expected to flow to American firms in St. Louis, Fort Worth, and Seattle, will instead see Canadian pilots flying aircraft assembled in Montreal with engines sourced from European partners and electronics supplied by Asia. Washington insiders described the decision as a direct response to Trump's sweeping tariff policy, which had targeted Canadian aluminum, steel, and aerospace components over the past year. What makes this move even more jarring is its timing. For months, the Pentagon had counted on Canadian orders to keep production lines humming at Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Instead, Canada's Defense Ministry declared it would pivot to secure supply chains beyond American politics. In plain terms, a critical U.S. ally has just cut America's defense giant out of the deal, choosing independence over dependency. Analysts warn the loss amounts to more than contracts. It's a rupture in North America's defense economy with shock waves reaching deep into U.S. cities that depend on aerospace jobs. Across America, the fallout is already being felt. In Fort Worth, home to thousands of Lockheed Martin workers, stunned employees gathered outside factory gates this morning as news of Canada's decision spread. What had been a steady flow of orders expected to keep assembly lines moving through Twin has suddenly evaporated. Local leaders warn that layoffs are inevitable. "We've built fighters for generations," one worker told reporters, "and now we're being undercut by our closest ally." In St. Louis, where Boeing's defense division anchors the city's economy, the mood is no less grim. Suppliers across Missouri depend on steady Pentagon-backed orders to keep their own shops running. From aluminum plants in the Midwest to avionics firms in California, ripple effects are cascading outward. Analysts estimate that more than 20,000 American jobs could be at risk if Canada's pivot holds, and that figure does not account for the secondary impact on small contractors that feed into the aerospace supply chain. The shock is not just economic, it's symbolic. For decades, the United States has been the undisputed source of high-end fighter jets for NATO allies. F-16s, F/A-18s, and now the F-35 have long been viewed as the backbone of Western air power. To see Ottawa openly turn away from American suppliers and toward a patchwork of European and Asian alternatives is a blow to U.S. prestige as much as to its economy. The Pentagon itself, according to insiders, was caught flat-footed. Officials had expected routine negotiations, not a sweeping rejection of American contracts. The emotional punch is compounded by geography. Many of the hardest hit states are politically pivotal. Texas, Missouri, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are all bracing for layoffs, wage freezes, and shrinking tax bases. Local politicians, mayors, and governors are already demanding auditing answers from Washington. How could America's closest allies suddenly cut the cord? And why wasn't the White House prepared? Economists point out that this isn't just about fighter jets. Aerospace is one of America's few industries where exports still dominate global markets. Each lost contract chips away at that advantage if other allies follow. Canada's lead, Washington, could face a domino effect where countries from Australia to Poland begin shopping elsewhere for their next generation fleets. That would mean more lost orders, more lost jobs, and a shrinking share of a market once considered untouchable at the consumer level. The shift is likely to drive up costs with fewer production orders per unit. Expenses for remaining jets rise, forcing the Pentagon to pay more per plane. Taxpayers ultimately foot the bill. Meanwhile, Canada and its European partners are promising cheaper alternatives, potentially creating a two-tier defense market, one where allies pay less for aircraft that don't bear a Made in America stamp. That dynamic could accelerate the erosion of U.S. dominance in military exports. Perhaps most striking is the psychological blow. For generations, Americans have been told that their defense industry is the envy of the world. From the Wright brothers to the stealth bomber, the United States has led the way in aviation. To watch Canada, one of America's closest allies, openly walk away undermines that narrative. It raises uncomfortable questions about whether tariffs and trade wars are strengthening or weakening the very industries they were meant to protect. Inside the Pentagon, frustration is boiling over. Senior officials reportedly warned months ago that tariff battles could alienate allies, making it harder to maintain defense partnerships. Their warnings, sources say, were brushed aside in favor of hardline rhetoric. Now, with contracts gone and jobs on the line, those warnings look prophetic. We didn't just lose business. One defense analyst said, "We lost trust." It's a story that stretches far beyond numbers on a balance sheet. These are families, neighborhoods, and entire towns caught in the crossfire of international trade politics. When Canada pulls the plug on billions in U.S. defense contracts, it's not just the Pentagon that feels the pain. It's the diner waitress serving coffee to laid-off machinists in Missouri, the school district in Texas losing tax revenue, the small business in Detroit wondering how to survive another downturn. This is the impact on the United States. Immediate, widespread, and deeply personal. And unless Washington finds a way to reverse course, America's workers may discover that the jobs they were promised protection for have become the very first casualties of a trade war gone wrong. Canada's decision to seize these contracts is not an isolated procurement move. It's a recalibration of power that reaches well beyond Ottawa or Washington. For decades, America's defense sector has operated with the unspoken assumption that its closest allies would buy American as a matter of both trust and necessity. Fighter jets were not just hardware. They were extensions of U.S. influence, anchors of NATO unity, and symbols of Washington's industrial supremacy. That framework is now cracking. What makes this rupture so striking is the scale of the prize. Fighter jets are not lumber or wheat. They are strategic assets that intertwine with sovereignty and security. By turning to European manufacturers and by making clear that the decision was a reaction to tariffs and trade strain, Canada is signaling that the old rules no longer apply. Even allies that share America's borders and defense treaties are willing to diversify if Washington's policies become too unpredictable. That message will not be lost on capitals in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. The broader economic impact begins with markets. Aerospace is one of America's few remaining sectors where exports reliably outweigh imports, generating billions annually and supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs across multiple states. Every contract lost to a competitor country chips away at that advantage, with Canada redirecting its procurement. Analysts warned that European suppliers could gain a foothold in markets once dominated by U.S. firms. Countries like Germany, France, and even South Korea are closely watching the Canadian shift. If Ottawa can successfully fly fleets without American jets, others may follow suit. The ripple effects extend further into supply chains. Fighter jet production is not a single factory endeavor. It draws on metals from Pennsylvania, electronics from California, composites from Kansas, and engines from Ohio. When a contract evaporates, each of these regions loses leverage. It also sends a powerful signal to the global supply network. America's defense exports are no longer a guaranteed anchor. In practical terms, this means European and Asian firms can begin negotiating from a stronger position, demanding better terms or larger shares of the global market. Over time, Washington's dominance could erode from structural reliance to competitive parity. Another layer of consequence is found in the global perception of U.S. political reliability. Trump's tariff battles were framed as tools to safeguard American workers. Yet from abroad, they're increasingly seen as destabilizing instruments that can ensnare allies as easily as rivals. Canada's move demonstrates that even the most integrated partners are seeking insulation from American volatility. This perception matters because it shapes future deals. Nations deciding on long-term defense partnerships weigh not only cost and capability, but also the predictability of supply. If Washington is viewed as unpredictable, doors open wider for others. Economists also point to the cascading effects on commodity markets. Fighter jets require titanium, aluminum, rare earth elements, and specialized composites. Canada's pivot to non-American suppliers redirects demand for those resources. Mines in Australia, electronics, factories in South Korea, and smelters in Scandinavia stand to gain. Meanwhile, American producers face the prospect of overcapacity and declining orders. This redistribution of demand may not sound dramatic on paper, but it compounds over time, shaping where industries expand, where new mines open, and which countries lock in long-term technological leadership. The strategic shock reaches into Asia as well. Nations like Japan and South Korea have long relied on U.S. fighters as the backbone of their defense. But Canada's diversification shows that alternatives exist. European fighters like the Eurofighter, Typhoon, or Sweden's Gripen, while historically considered secondary gain credibility when adopted by a NATO member in good standing. If Ottawa can Integrate those platforms effectively. Asian allies may see justification to hedge their bets. That shift could ripple back into U.S. strategy, complicating Washington's efforts to maintain cohesive fleets among its allies. From a purely financial perspective, the numbers are sobering. Analysts estimate that Canada's redirection of contracts represents tens of billions in potential lost revenue for American firms over the coming decade. But the true cost lies in momentum. Aerospace innovation thrives on large orders that justify investment.